Winchester's barrel caught the first light of dawn as Cole Morgan tracked the approaching riders through its scope. Not random travelers, these riders moved with military precision across the valley toward his ranch. Morgan's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breathing slow and measured as it had been on countless battlefields during the war between the states. But something wasn't right. The Apache warriors, and there were at least 20, rode in formation, too disciplined for a raid, too methodical, too deliberate. Morgan lowered his rifle slightly, squinting against the morning sun. No war cries, no flanking maneuvers, just a steady, purposeful advance toward his property line. And there, at the front, a woman. Morgan adjusted his position on the ridge overlooking his homestead. 15 years ranching in Arizona territory had taught him Apache war parties didn't include women. They certainly weren't led by them. The woman wore traditional war paint across half her face, but even from this distance, Morgan could see she rode differently than the others, straighter, more formally, almost like cavalry. The war party halted precisely 50 yards from his fence line, and Morgan felt the hair on his neck rise. Apache raiders never stopped to announce themselves. They struck like lightning, without warning or mercy. When the woman dismounted alone and walked forward, hands empty and visible, Morgan made his decision. He rose from his position, Winchester cradled but ready, and walked down to meet her. "If you wanted me dead," he called out, "you wouldn't have ridden in like the Union Army on parade." The woman stopped at his fence line, her eyes dark and penetrating, fixed on his face. Something in those eyes sent an electric current down Morgan's spine, a memory buried deep but never forgotten. "Hello, Cole Morgan," she said, her English flawless and barely accented. That voice, it couldn't be. Not after 15 years. Not after he'd been told, "Kiona?" The name felt strange on his lips after so many years. The woman's face remained stoic, but her eyes confirmed what seemed impossible. This was the same Apache girl he'd found bleeding and barely alive by the creek all those years ago. The 12-year-old child he'd hidden and nursed back to health after Victor Bishop's militia had massacred her village. "You remember," she said quietly. "Good." Morgan's mind reeled. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been a broken child, handed over to missionary care after he'd healed her worst wounds. The soldiers had promised safe passage to the reservation. Obviously, that hadn't happened. "You've changed," he managed, the understatement hanging in the air between them. "So have you," Kiona replied, her gaze tracking the new lines in his face, the silver threading through his dark hair. "But some things never change, like Victor Bishop's hunger for land that isn't his." Morgan's hand tightened on his rifle. Memories of the war flooded back, the same rage he'd felt when confronted with injustice, the same hatred for men who preyed on the vulnerable. "Bishop? What does that bastard have to do with—" Kiona reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew an official-looking document. 3 days from now, Bishop plans to seize your ranch. He has forged debt papers claiming you borrowed $800 for cattle feed and supplies. "That's horse shit. I've never borrowed a cent." "I know," Kiona's voice cut through his protest. "This is the 17th ranch he's targeted with forged documents. The other 16 families weren't as fortunate as you're about to be." Morgan's face darkened. "What happened to them?" "They lost everything. Their land, homes, livestock. Bishop has a persuasive lawyer and a judge who asks no questions." Kiona paused, her expression hardening. "But he made a critical mistake when he chose your ranch." "What mistake?" "He chose to steal from the one man who saved my life." Kiona's eyes burned with intensity. "And that, Cole Morgan, is a debt I can never let go unpaid." Morgan studied the transformed woman before him. The scared, broken child was gone, replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority and dangerous intelligence. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "Because after you saved me, I didn't vanish into nothing," Kiona replied. I was taken in by a missionary family who recognized my aptitude. They sent me to schools in St. Louis and Boston. I studied law, strategy, and medicine from both worlds, yours and mine. She gestured toward the mounted warriors. These men follow me not because of bloodline or tradition. They follow because I've given them purpose and the skills to achieve it. Morgan's tactical mind was already calculating. Bishop won't come alone. No, he'll bring Sheriff Reynolds and Dr. Garrett, the son of the physician who helped treat me at your ranch 15 years ago. Morgan remembered old Dr. Garrett well, the only man he trusted enough to help save Kiona's life. The doctor had sworn an oath of secrecy that night. His son is involved in this? The son inherited his father's practice and his debts to Bishop. Kiona's voice carried cold anger. He sold information about you to pay what he owed. But more than that, Bishop has recruited him to declare any resistant landowner mentally unstable. Convenient diagnosis, Morgan growled. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his shoulder. A rebel bullet at Antietam. He'd seen enough corruption in war to recognize it in peace. There's something else you need to know, Kiona said, her voice dropping. Bishop isn't planning to just seize your ranch. According to my sources, he intends to make an example of you. A public demonstration of what happens to anyone who helps Apache people. Morgan understood immediately. He's planning to kill me and make it look justified. Kiona nodded. He's been telling people you're dangerous, that you're planning to attack the town with Apache allies. Tomorrow's seizure is meant to look like preventive justice. Morgan felt cold fury building in his chest. It was the same fury that had driven him through 4 years of bloody warfare. Part of him had hoped never to feel it again. Another part welcomed it like an old friend. Then we'd better give the good doctor a taste of his own medicine. Kiona reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small vial. This is concentrated extract from wild potato root. In small doses, it causes intense but brief stomach upset, symptoms that mimic serious illness without causing permanent damage. Morgan considered the plan, then shook his head. Not enough. If Bishop wants blood, we need to be ready to give him a fight. He nodded toward the Winchester. 15 years ago, I saved you with medicine. Tomorrow we might need bullets. The words hung between them, Morgan suddenly aware of what he was suggesting. An alliance that defied everything he'd once believed. A Union veteran partnering with Apache warriors. The very notion would have been unthinkable to the younger man who'd fought at Shiloh and Gettysburg. But 15 years on the frontier changes a man. 15 years watching the strong prey on the weak rewrites the rules of engagement. For the first time, a ghost of a smile crossed Kiona's face. My thoughts exactly. Dawn broke with crimson fingers over Morgan's ranch. He stood on his porch, the Winchester cleaned and loaded, watching the horizon. Kiona's warriors were positioned strategically around the property, invisible to the untrained eye, but a lethal force if needed. Morgan checked his Colt one last time, the familiar weight comforting against his hip. He'd hoped never to use it in anger again after the war. But some fights couldn't be avoided. Some battles chose you. The sound of approaching horses pulled Morgan's attention to the main road. Right on schedule. 3 riders approached, Sheriff Reynolds in his official vest, Dr. Garrett carrying his medical bag, and Victor Bishop in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place on the frontier. Morgan straightened his posture and lowered his rifle, playing the part of the unsuspecting rancher. "Morning, gentlemen," he called as they approached. His voice betrayed nothing of the cold calculation beneath. Sheriff Reynolds looked uncomfortable as he dismounted. "Morning, Morgan. Afraid I'm here on official business." Bishop didn't bother with pleasantries. His eyes gleamed with anticipated victory as he surveyed the property, already measuring it for profit. "Mr. Morgan," Bishop said, his voice smooth as an undertaker's, "I believe you're aware of your outstanding debt." "Can't say that I am." Morgan replied evenly. Never borrowed from you or anyone else. But you gentlemen look like you've had a long ride. Coffee? How hospitable, Bishop said with a thin smile. Yes, coffee would be welcome. Morgan disappeared inside briefly, returning with a tray of steaming cups. He handed the chipped mug to Bishop deliberately, careful not to let his fingers touch the man's hand. Sugar's already in it, Morgan said casually. The men accepted their drinks, Dr. Garrett avoiding Morgan's eyes. Only Bishop maintained his confident demeanor, sipping his coffee while studying Morgan with predatory interest. Now then, Sheriff Reynolds began awkwardly. Mr. Bishop claims you owe him $800 for supplies and feed from 2 years back. He has documentation. Morgan shook his head firmly. That's completely false, Sheriff. I keep careful records of all my transactions. Dr. Garrett spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a nervous edge. Do you have receipts proving you paid cash? Of course, they're inside. Morgan gestured toward the house. How convenient, Bishop said with a smirk. Papers that could easily be forged after the fact. Sheriff Reynolds frowned. Hold on, Bishop. Morgan's word has always been good in this territory. Has it? Bishop challenged. Sheriff, are you aware that Mr. Morgan here has a history of harboring dangerous fugitives? Morgan felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. What are you talking about? Reynolds asked. 15 years ago, Bishop said, his voice carrying false indignation, Morgan provided aid and comfort to an Apache warrior after a raid on civilian settlements. Dr. Garrett's father documented the entire incident. Garrett shifted uncomfortably. My father's notes indicate medical treatment was provided to an Apache individual at this ranch. A child, Morgan said firmly, eyes locking with Bishop's. A wounded child who would have died without help. A potential threat to the entire community, Bishop countered. By your own admission, you harbored a hostile Apache on your property. Sheriff Reynolds looked confused, but before he could respond, Bishop suddenly doubled over, his face contorting in pain. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he clutched his stomach. Something's wrong, he gasped. I feel terrible. Dr. Garrett set down his coffee cup and moved toward Bishop, but Morgan noticed something peculiar. Instead of examining his patient, Garrett glanced nervously at Sheriff Reynolds, as if calculating how his next actions would appear. What's wrong with him? Reynolds demanded. I'm not sure, Garrett stammered, pulling out a stethoscope with shaking hands. Mr. Bishop, can you describe your symptoms? Bishop was now sweating profusely, his expensive suit darkening at the collar. Cramping, nausea, feels like... Morgan watched Garrett's reaction carefully. The young doctor seemed more concerned about the legal documents in Bishop's coat pocket than his patient's condition. No checking of pulse, no questions about onset of symptoms, no attempt to determine the cause. Bishop's discomfort grew visibly worse, but through gritted teeth, he managed to snarl, The papers, Sheriff, the seizure order, now. That's when a gunshot cracked the morning air. All heads turned to see Bishop holding a smoking revolver, aimed squarely at Morgan's chest. Only his pain-racked aim had saved Morgan's life. The bullet had splintered the porch post inches from his head. Enough games, Bishop hissed. I won't be poisoned by an Indian lover. Sheriff Reynolds drew his weapon in shock. Bishop, have you lost your mind? Morgan dove for cover as Bishop fired again, this time the bullet tearing through Morgan's sleeve. In one fluid motion, Morgan rolled and came up with his Colt, returning fire with a devastating accuracy that had once earned him commendations in the 2nd Minnesota. His bullet struck Bishop's hand, sending the revolver spinning into the dust. Bishop howled in pain and rage. Reynolds! Morgan shouted. That seizure order is forged. This man's trying to steal my land and kill me to cover his tracks. From inside the house, Kiona emerged with 2 journals in her hands. Her sudden appearance sent Dr. Garrett into panic. "That's her!" he shouted, fumbling for a hidden derringer. "The Apache girl! She should be dead!" Morgan's second shot struck Garrett's shoulder with surgical precision, spinning him to the ground. The doctor's weapon discharged harmlessly into the air. Sheriff Reynolds stood frozen, his pistol moving between the wounded men and Morgan. "What in God's name is happening here?" Kiona walked calmly toward Reynolds, holding out the journals. "Sheriff, I have evidence that will explain everything. These men aren't here for debt collection. They're here to murder Cole Morgan and steal his land." Bishop, clutching his bleeding hand, sneered through pain. "She's a savage. You can't believe a word." "She's a trained lawyer," Morgan interrupted, keeping his pistol trained on Bishop. "And she has proof of 16 other fraudulent seizures you've conducted." Reynolds holstered his weapon slowly, taking the journals from Kiona. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he flipped through the pages. "These notes from old Dr. Garrett describe treating a severely injured 12-year-old girl," he said, looking up at Kiona with dawning recognition. "Not a warrior," Kiona nodded. "I was attacked while gathering medicinal plants, left for dead because they assumed no one would care about one missing Apache girl." She opened the second journal. "And this contains detailed records of how Bishop creates fraudulent debt documents, the process, the forged seals, even the names of officials he's bribed to validate false claims." Reynolds' face hardened as he continued reading. "Where did you get this?" "From a clerk in Bishop's office who grew tired of being part of a criminal enterprise," Kiona replied. 16 families have lost their ranches to this exact scheme. Morgan's was to be the 17th. From the distance came the sound of approaching horses, dozens of them. Bishop struggled to his feet, a desperate smile crossing his face. "You hear that? Those are my men. You're all dead." Morgan exchanged a glance with Kiona. This wasn't part of their plan, but Kiona remained calm. "Those aren't your men, Bishop." Over the ridge appeared a procession unlike anything Reynolds had ever seen. Families on horseback and in wagons, settlers of all ages with hard, determined expressions. Alongside them rode more Apache warriors, creating an impossible alliance. "What is this?" Bishop demanded, his voice rising with panic. "Justice," Kiona said simply. "The 16 families you cheated, united with those who've survived your raids." A gray-haired man stepped forward from the crowd. "Sheriff Reynolds, we've come with evidence. This man stole our farms through forged loan documents, just like he's trying to do to Morgan." One by one, families began producing evidence they had gathered. Letters with authentic signatures that didn't match the loan documents. Receipts showing cash payments for supplies Bishop claimed were purchased on credit. Testimonies from neighbors. Bishop's face contorted with rage. "This changes nothing. I still have the judge in my pocket. Howard will never rule against me." "Judge Howard is under arrest," came a new voice from the crowd. A thin man in a city suit emerged, Bishop's former clerk. "Federal marshals took him into custody this morning. I delivered evidence of judicial corruption yesterday." Bishop looked around wildly, realizing he was cornered. With surprising speed for a wounded man, he lurched toward a nearby child, grabbing her by the collar and dragging her against him as a shield. "Back off!" he shouted, his bloodied hand pressed against the terrified child's throat. "I'm riding out of here and she's coming with me until I'm clear." Reynolds raised his pistol but couldn't risk a shot with the child in danger. Morgan lowered his weapon as well, jaw clenched in fury. "Let her go, Bishop," Morgan said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between us." "There's no us anymore, Morgan," Bishop snarled, backing toward his horse, dragging the struggling child. "There's just me walking away from this. Anyone follows, she dies." The crowd parted silently as Bishop mounted his horse, awkwardly keeping hold of the child. With a vicious kick to the animal's flanks, he galloped away. the child's screams fading into the distance. "My daughter!" cried a woman from the crowd. "He's taken my Sarah!" Morgan was already racing for his stallion. "Kiona!" he called over his shoulder. "North Ridge Trail! Cut him off!" Kiona nodded once, signaling to 4 of her warriors. They mounted in fluid motion and disappeared into the trees while Morgan took the direct route, pushing his horse to a full gallop. The pursuit stretched over miles of rough terrain, Morgan gaining steadily on Bishop's heavier mount. The land told its story to Morgan's experienced eyes. Disturbed rocks, bent grass, a child's bonnet caught on a branch. Bishop was heading for the narrow canyon that led to the territorial border. When Morgan spotted them, Bishop was nearing the canyon entrance. The child was still fighting, making it difficult for him to control the horse. Morgan raised his Winchester, but the distance and the moving targets made a safe shot impossible. He would have to get closer. Suddenly, from the ridge above the canyon, Kiona and her warriors appeared. They had circled around, using their superior knowledge of the land to cut off Bishop's escape route. Bishop reined in hard, trapped between Morgan behind and the Apache ahead. The child took advantage of the moment, biting Bishop's arm. With a howl of pain, he flung her from him. She tumbled down the rocky slope. Morgan didn't hesitate. He abandoned his pursuit of Bishop and threw himself from his horse, sliding down the embankment to catch the child before she struck the jagged rocks below. They landed in a cloud of dust, Morgan's body cushioning her fall. Bishop seized what he thought was his opportunity. He spurred his horse toward the canyon entrance. Believing Kiona and her warriors wouldn't fire with Morgan and the child in the potential line of fire, he was wrong. An Apache arrow struck with unerring aim, piercing Bishop's shoulder and sending him crashing from his mount. He tumbled across the hard ground, coming to rest against a boulder. Morgan checked the child quickly, scared but unharmed, before making his way to where Bishop lay groaning. "It's over, Bishop," Morgan said, standing over the fallen man. "The land grabbing, the killing, all of it ends today." Bishop looked up, blood seeping through his expensive suit. His eyes burned with hatred. "You think this changes anything? There will always be men like me, Morgan. Men who take what they want." "Maybe so," Morgan replied, hauling Bishop to his feet. "But there will always be men like me too." Kiona approached, her expression unreadable behind the war paint. For a moment, Morgan thought she might kill Bishop where he stood. It would have been justice by Apache law, a life for the lives he had taken. Instead, she spoke quietly in her native tongue to her warriors, who lowered their weapons. "Not like this," she said to Morgan. "He faces the white man's justice for crimes against all peoples." Bishop's trial became the talk of the Arizona Territory. 16 families testified about the forged debt papers. The federal prosecutor presented evidence of judicial bribes, falsified documents, and conspiracy to commit murder. Dr. Garrett turned state's evidence, confessing to his role in declaring landowners mentally unfit to facilitate Bishop's schemes. Judge Howard was removed from the bench and sentenced to 10 years for judicial corruption. When the verdict came, it was unequivocal. Bishop received 20 years in Yuma Territorial Prison, a place few survived their full sentence. 3 months after the trial, Morgan stood on his porch, watching the sunrise paint the valley gold. His ranch was secure, his reputation restored. The territorial court, embarrassed by the scope of the corruption, had expedited the process of returning properties to the defrauded families. Throughout the valley, new homes were rising, families rebuilding what Bishop had stolen. But more remarkably, Apache and settlers worked alongside each other in many places, an uneasy alliance born of shared suffering and common enemies. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Morgan from his thoughts. Kiona rode alone, as she had that first morning 3 months ago. "Morning," she called, dismounting near his fence. "Coffee's hot," Morgan replied with a nod. They sat in the companionable silence, watching the valley come alive with morning light. The relationship between them had evolved into something Morgan had never expected, genuine respect built on shared purpose. I received a letter from the territorial capital yesterday, Kiona said. They're offering me a position as liaison between tribal governments and territorial courts. Morgan raised his eyebrows. That's quite an honor. The work I've been doing, helping families fight corruption, organizing legal challenges, could become much more effective with official backing. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully, but it would mean more time in offices and courtrooms. Sounds like you're torn between two worlds again. No, Kiona said with a slight smile. I've finally learned that I don't have to choose. I can bridge them. She gestured toward the valley where smoke rose from the chimneys of restored homesteads. These people aren't just Apache or settlers anymore. They've stood together against injustice. That's a new kind of community. Morgan nodded, understanding. And your warriors? The alliance you built? We've proven that different peoples can unite for justice. That's powerful in these changing times. Her expression grew serious. But it can't end with Bishop. Morgan studied her face. What are you thinking? There are more like him out there. Men who use paper and law to steal what doesn't belong to them. Men who believe a badge or a title gives them the right to decide who lives and who dies. Morgan set down his coffee cup. What if we made it official? Not just land protection, but a force, settlers and Apache working together to protect what's rightfully theirs. Kiona's eyes lit with interest. A protection unit? With your legal training and my military experience, Morgan continued, warming to the idea, we could do more than just defend one ranch at a time. We could be peacekeepers where the law fails. The territorial governor might not approve of such a force, Kiona said, but her tone suggested she was already considering possibilities. We wouldn't be asking permission, Morgan replied, just doing what needs to be done, by any means necessary. The words hung between them, a former Union soldier suggesting what amounted to vigilante justice, but Morgan had seen enough of life to know sometimes the law needed help to find its way. Kiona extended her hand. Partners. They shook hands, sealing an agreement that felt like the completion of a circle begun 15 years ago with a dying child and a compassionate rancher. Morgan pulled a wrapped package from beside his chair. I had this made for you in town. Kiona unwrapped the cloth to reveal a finely crafted Colt revolver, her name engraved in Apache symbols along the barrel. 15 years ago, I taught you how to heal, Morgan said quietly. Seems you've taught me something about justice and honor. As they looked out over the valley, dust rose on the horizon. Riders approaching from the south. Trouble? Kiona asked, her hand moving instinctively to the new revolver. Morgan picked up his Winchester, checking the chamber with practiced ease. Could be, or could be another family needing help. They stood together on the porch, weapons ready but not raised, watching the approaching riders with the steady patience of people who had faced death and chosen life. The debt of blood that began 15 years ago had been repaid in full, but something new had taken its place, a bond forged in battle and sealed with shared purpose. Either way, Morgan said with grim determination, looks like our new venture starts now. Kiona nodded, her war-painted face catching the morning light. Some debts are never truly settled, Cole Morgan. They just transform into something stronger. As the riders drew closer, Morgan and Kiona stood their ground, two figures from different worlds united by a common cause, justice in a land where the law often served only those with money and power. Behind them, the alliance of Apache warriors and settler families watched from strategic positions around the ranch. A new kind of peace forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Their silhouettes stretched long across the dusty yard, a new legend taking shape in the unforgiving Arizona sun. The protectors of the valley, some would later call them. Others simply knew them as the people you turned to when justice needed a helping hand.